Okay, I think things are good to get started. Thanks again, everybody, for being here after the lunch hour, or maybe you're late lunch eating people like myself, and that's fine too. My name is Danielle, and I'm with San Francisco Planning, and we're here today to talk about the Environmental Justice Working Group. So next slide, please. We wanted to share with everybody that this session is being recorded. And later on, we'll put this on our YouTube and website so that people can rewatch later if they weren't able to join during this hour. When you all came, your audio and video were turned off just so that it's not too noisy when everybody joins in. And you're also welcome to participate in the chat. San Francisco Planning is committed to creating a safe and inclusive space. So please use the chat with intention and with respect for one another. And we're excited to be able to use that later on in the session to engage and have a broader dialogue with you. Next, please. So we wanted to start our session with a land acknowledgement. And we want to thank the American Indian Cultural District for guiding the planning department on this acknowledgement. So on the screen, you should see a map on the left-hand side of the unceded historic and traditional territories of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, which is the entire San Francisco Peninsula in the red-orangish color. And so we, as San Francisco Planning, want to acknowledge that we're on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, who are the original inhabitants of the SF Peninsula. As the indigenous stewards of this land, and in accordance with their traditions, the Ramaytush Ohlone have never ceded, lost, nor forgotten their responsibilities as the caretakers of this place, as well as for all peoples who reside in their traditional territory. As guests, we recognize that we benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland. And so we want to pay our respects by acknowledging the ancestors, elders, and relatives of the Ramaytush community, and by affirming their rights, their sovereign rights as First Peoples. And so thank you all again for being here, for your time and energy focusing on environmental justice in San Francisco. So just to kick things off, we invite you all to do a little icebreaker in the chat, since unfortunately we just don't have the time to go through everybody one by one. And so in the chat, please type out your name, your organization, if applicable, or neighborhood, and share how you're hoping to celebrate Earth Day this year, which is on April 22nd in a little bit more than a month. Thank you, Lisa. You're hoping to spend time working in your vegetable garden during Earth Day. That's great. Other people are welcome as well. Let's see a few others just to see what's on people's minds. Nathan, enjoy the weather outside. That's great. Even the weather today is great. You don't even need to wait for Earth Day. That's awesome. We have more gardeners. Awesome. More people enjoying the outdoors. Lovely. Cool. Great. You're totally welcome to keep on chatting in the chat. Thanks, everybody. It's awesome to know everybody's here and has these great ideas of being together and outside. Okay, so again, we're here for the next hour or so to talk about the Environmental Justice Working Group. And this is both an informational session and Q&A period. My name is Danielle No. I use she and her pronouns, and I am with the San Francisco Planning Department with my colleague Lisa Chen, which you'll hear in a moment, who's a Senior Community Development Specialist. And so we'll go through a brief overview of our work to contextualize and ground this space for like max 10 minutes. And then we'll open up for our audience Q&A where we can hear from you in the chat and other ways to have more of a dialogue. Okay, so we'll start by talking about an environmental justice framework, which will contextualize the environmental justice working group that you are all interested in today. And so when we talk about environmental justice, the planning department has a working definition, which you can see on the screen. And our working definition of environmental justice means the equitable distribution of environmental benefits and elimination of environmental burdens to promote healthy communities where all San Franciscans can thrive. As government, such as SF planning, the government can foster environmental justice through processes that amend past injustices while enabling proactive community-led solutions for the future. And this working definition is grounded in um, principles of environmental justice that the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit in 1991 guided. And the link is on the screen, and I'll also put it in the chat right now for you all to explore if you're unfamiliar. Okay, next slide, please. And so we know that environmental justice and injustices and equity challenges appear in our local communities in San Francisco. It can show up through access to healthy food, healthcare, respiratory and other health outcomes, life expectancy, as well as we know, exposure and impact to COVID. And so a lot of these challenges are adversely impacted, disproportionately burdened on communities of color and low income communities in San Francisco. And that's a real problem. Next slide, please. And so, why are we trying to work on environmental justice now? Why are we planning for environmental justice, and what brings about this work? There's a state legislation from the California Senate, SB 1000, which has provided us and other jurisdictions around the state with the opportunity to work on environmental justice with intention. And so in SB 1000, there's two main actions or provisions. One, which is designating a map of environmental justice communities. So we have a draft map of environmental justice communities in San Francisco that we'll get to in a moment. And that's one major action so that we can identify the neighborhoods and communities that are most impacted by environmental justice. The second action is to adopt policies in the general plan to address these unique and compounded health risks, also known as environmental injustices. So again, a map to identify the communities and adopting policies to codify this work in the general plan, which is a major document that San Francisco planning stewards. As well as that state legislation in 2020, last year, the Planning Commission and Historic Preservation Commission called upon general plan amendments to explicitly address racial and social equity for the benefit of Black communities, Indigenous communities, and other communities of color in San Francisco. And so, with the last bullet, our approach to tackle all of this work is to create an environmental justice framework that integrates these environmental justice policies throughout the general plan. It'll incorporate environmental justice, racial and social equity, and be tied to many prongs and elements in the general plan, such as the housing element, transportation element, and safety and resilience element. Next slide, please. And so I just mentioned the draft environmental justice communities map that we worked on to help us with SB 1000, which you can see on the screen. And so this map is based on a state map that's co-stewarded by Cal Environmental Protection Agency and OEHA. It's called Cal EnviroScreen 3.0, which describes exposure to pollution as well as demographic data. From that base map, we have added additional data, more local data, more detailed data to be more specific about the neighborhoods in San Francisco that are adversely impacted by environmental justice. And so on the map, you can see the areas in red are where we're identifying with the highest amount of environmental justice burden. And these neighborhoods are listed on the right side: Bayview, Hunters Point, Chinatown, Mission, Potrero Hill, south of Market, Tenderloin, Treasure Island, Visitation Valley, and Western Addition. And then the areas in green are the neighborhoods in San Francisco with the least amount of environmental burden. And then the areas in gray are just our major parks that we wanted to eliminate to avoid some confusion. So Golden Gate Park, McLaren Park, Lincoln Park. And then, oh, wait, sorry, I don't think that's Lincoln Park. My bad. The map is too small on my screen. And then I just also want to point out the area above, like in the middle area, that's red and gray hashed. That area is around Islayas Creek in the Bayview Hunters Point community. And we're identifying it as red, but also want to acknowledge that that area doesn't show up in the state level map because of a relatively low population size. But we do know that there are people who live there and they do face a lot of environmental burden. So that's that with the draft map. And that's one major thing that we would love to work with the Environmental Justice Working Group. Okay, next slide, please. And so the second item under SB 1000 that I mentioned are these general plan policies. And when we mean policies in the general plan, we want to tackle the breadth of environmental justice indicators and factors, which include clean and healthy environments, healthy food access, healthy public facilities, safe, healthy, and affordable housing, physical activity, racial equity and empowered neighborhoods, climate resilience and justice, and equitable and green jobs. And so that's a lot of types of policies, but they all fit within that working definition of environmental justice we started with and affect a lot of the health burdens and environmental conditions that are mentioned in our motivation. And now I'm going to pass the mic to my colleague Lisa Chen, who will talk about how this can show up in our general plan.
Thank you, Danielle. So again, I'm Lisa Chen. I'm with the planning department. And so I know some folks might be new to the general plan. So we just wanted to give a specific example so that you have an idea of the types of policies that this environmental justice framework could include. So this is a current example from our adopted general plan in the recreation and open space element, which is one of the chapters of the plan. It includes this policy 1.2, which you see on the right, which basically specifies that the city as a whole should prioritize new open spaces and renovated open spaces in what it calls high needs areas. And at the time that the plan was adopted, which was 2014, it actually included this analysis, which is the map you see in the middle of the screen. So this is an example of a policy that's actually kind of grown and evolved over time since 2014. So Rec Park has since pivoted to what they're calling the equity zones. You can see kind of the more recent map on the left side, really identifying a lot of the areas that you actually also saw in the EJ Communities map that Danielle already showed. So a lot of the southeast parts of the city, Treasure Island, Central City, areas where we know that there's a lot of health burdens and also a lot of challenges in accessing high quality open space. And Rec Park has actually used this map to justify projects like the India Basin, where they are planning to build several continuous miles of open space along the southeast waterfront, which will be a great resource for the surrounding communities as well as the city and region as a whole. So yeah, the general plan, as you can see, it's really kind of thinking big picture and aspirational, and thinking about, you know, what we want to see the city look like in 10, 25 or more years. So we're going to pivot now and talk specifically about the Environmental Justice Working Group, which is why you're all here. So, you know, why are we creating this group? And I hope you do get a chance to check out the EJ principles that Danielle mentioned. Another related document that came out of a summit in subsequent years is called the Jemez Principles for Democratic Organizing. And one of the key principles is let people speak for themselves. So we fully acknowledge that, you know, as government servants, public servants, you know, we cannot create environmental justice priorities for the city. You know, we really need this to come from organizations, people, neighborhoods, businesses that are confronting environmental justice challenges in their neighborhoods. And so we are hoping that this group will serve as an opportunity for city and community members to partner together to really define what are the priorities and goals and vision for environmental justice in San Francisco in the future. So just to kind of dive into some of the details, and please feel free to start thinking of questions if we don't cover them in this overview. We'll have plenty of time at the end to go over questions. So the scope and the goals of the working group. We plan, as I mentioned, for this to be a mixed group of both community members and city staff. So we're partnering really closely with other agencies like SFDPH, Department of Public Health, Department of Environment, PUC, Office of Racial Equity, and others. And we're hoping that this group will really be almost like a brain trust, or really a group of people who can come together with different levels or different areas of expertise to really co-create this framework. And we anticipate that the group will meet monthly for 6 months. So right now we're targeting May through October. And the meetings we think will be probably, in the range of 1 to 2 hours each. And right now we're planning for these to be virtual, but of course, if the level of community spread and public health guidance allows, we would love to do in-person outreach at some point. So we'll have to see. And then subgroups might choose to meet in addition to these larger working group meetings. So hopefully that gives you a sense of the commitment. We are hoping that people who sign up for this will really try to make all of the meetings. So just keep that in mind as you're applying. We don't have the time of the meeting scheduled. What we are planning to do is, after we, select people to be on the group, we're gonna, do all the doodling polls and everything to try to find times that work for as many people as possible. And there will be stipends that are available for the community participants. And I just wanted to highlight a kind of a case study on the left side. Seattle did somewhat of a similar process several years ago. They created an an equity and environment agenda, which I encourage you to take a look at. It's on their website. And they basically convened kind of leaders from different environmental and environmental justice organizations across the city to really help the city develop this platform for how to increase diversity within the environmental movement and to address environmental justice more broadly. In terms of the selection criteria for the working group, this is all also in the application, which we're gonna make sure is posted into the chat. But just kind of running through some of what we're looking for. We are hoping to have somewhere in the range of 7 to 15 leaders from the community. And the criteria are going to be based on, whether they demonstrate that they are working actively with BIPOC communities in San Francisco. The diversity, we'll also be considering the diversity of race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status of people who are applying. We want to consider diversity of age and formal education. We want to both have, maybe new and emerging leaders as well as more established leaders in our communities to just get a range of ideas. We also want diversity of sex, gender identity, and sexual orientation, as well as neighborhood representation. So specifically, we want to make sure that we're really covering the neighborhoods that we identified on the map that we showed earlier, areas that are most burdened by environmental injustice. We are also looking for people and organizations who are, connected to a wide network of community members. And then also, we do want to see people who are committed to this work, so who plan to attend the working group meetings, share information with their networks, and who want to engage with this work and with coalitions and partner organizations. In addition to the Environmental Justice Working Group, when you see the application, you'll notice there's kind of a part 2 that includes an optional application to apply for community engagement grants. So kind of in keeping with the spirit of really wanting to partner with communities, we are also seeking 2 to 4 community-based organizations who want to receive a community engagement grant. And that grant will be to support additional outreach on this project. So that could include things like hosting focus groups and listening sessions. It could be administering surveys to community members, doing media outreach, whether social media or traditional media, or it could be other activities. We're really hoping to, work with whoever gets selected to come up with ideas for how to really do effective outreach, especially right now during a time that it's extremely difficult to do outreach, and people are feeling tapped out already. So if you are interested and you feel like this might fit in with the work your organization already does, we really strongly encourage you to apply. And then, if for some reason, if you don't want to apply for the working group, or if you're not selected, but you want to stay involved, we encourage you to sign up for email updates, and we'll post that in the chat, or I see it's already in the chat. And that'll be the key way that we're keeping people informed of upcoming activities. So things like the focus groups, surveys, and then other events. And then also, please feel free to get in touch. You can email me at the address here if you have more questions or suggestions, or if you want to schedule a meeting. We'd love to talk with you. So yes, we really hope you will apply. We are excited that we've already gotten some strong applications. We look forward to hearing from you. And so we're now going to pivot to Q&A. And I haven't seen that. I've seen a few questions, but please feel free to start typing other questions that you have into the chat. And Danielle and I will be monitoring them. And we have a few questions here to get us started in case it takes a little while for people to think of questions. All right, so so Danielle's going to be kind of moderating the questions, but maybe I'll just get started with one of the questions that we have kind of pre-planned. So just a kind of a note on why we're making this working group a mixed group of both city and community members. For those of you who have been part of other planning processes before, you may know that it's somewhat common to have like a CAC, like a community advisory group, and then maybe you'll have like a separate TAC, a technical advisory committee, or and they might not even speak to each other. One might be more community members, one might be more like city or other experts. And we really felt strongly after speaking with some of our partner agencies that it would be more productive to have a mixed group, because we want to make sure that whatever solutions and ideas we come up with have the best chance of success. And so we really feel like having diversity of voices in the group is important, including, with the city who, like this environmental justice framework is basically going to be helping direct the city to advance environmental justice. So I'm going to take an audience question. So we had a question: can I apply to the working group as an individual and the grant as an organization? So that is a great question. You absolutely can. Yeah, so you don't necessarily have to be solely in charge of being on the working group and then doing all the outreach yourself. We anticipate that organizations will tap into their other resources or other activities that they're doing. We also have a question, what is the process of selecting working group members? Hopefully the criteria that we showed on the slide earlier was helpful for people. Those same criteria are in the application itself. So we're going to use that as kind of our initial screen as we're reviewing and comparing the applications. We really do want to make sure that we have a diversity of neighborhoods represented, people's backgrounds, the types of organizations, the types of issues that people are working on, and then just people's backgrounds themselves, race, age, education, so on. And then beyond that, we are planning to work with our agency partners. So I mentioned, we're working closely with Department of Public Health and SF Environment and other agencies. So yeah, we're going to have a process where we kind of just see who all applies, and then kind of go through a more formal scoring and selection process. And then we have another question about whether this presentation and recording will be available. We are planning to do that so that we can send a follow-up email when both of those are posted on our website. I have another question. So quickly looking at the map, it seems that part of the Excelsior is red, but I don't see it listed as a neighborhood. And another map question, at some point, can you share the local data that was added to the Cal Virus Green map? So I don't know who asked this question, but thank you. We always love interest in the map itself. And as Danielle mentioned, as the working group and other outreach get started, we plan to get more feedback on the map. So that map is definitely draft. Keep that in mind. So the Excelsior, we can actually go back to the map if it would be helpful to see it. It's also on our website. Excelsior itself is like the way it's labeled is not showing up as red, but areas that are very close to it are more red. So kind of like more outer Mission, and then like also closer to the Portola, like as you get to that part of the freeway, there are more areas that are in red. We do know that the Excelsior is an area that has a lot of challenges. And so even though we haven't called it out specifically in the bullet points because it doesn't itself show up as bright red, we definitely would welcome people from the Excelsior to apply. So I hope that answers the question. And then the other question about the data sources for the map. So we haven't posted that on our website yet, but we are planning to put together kind of like a technical document, just showing a little bit of the process that we went through to draft the map. So that should be up relatively soon. But one of the key areas where we really added a lot of local data was air pollution. So for those of you who are a little bit familiar with Cal Virus Green, you'll know that they're using kind of more regional pollution data, and the sensors are not always great. Sometimes they're not even in San Francisco, but we have done a lot of modeling at the city level, so we're able to add more detailed local data. Okay, another question that came up. What is the end product of the Environmental Justice Working Group? So this kind of goes back to what Danielle was saying at the beginning. The ultimate goal and the ultimate reason that we're doing this is because the state is basically requiring all cities to address environmental justice in their general plan. So in terms of the specific products, we're going to be creating policies that can go into then the general plan and the various elements. So like the housing element, transportation element, etc. But for the working group itself, I think it's going to be even a little bit higher level, because this environmental justice framework is going to be looking, kind of broadly, what are the key priorities and goals for environmental justice across a whole range of policy topics. And the reason we decided to do this is because, so we basically have the option of creating an environmental justice like element, like a chapter of the general plan, or embedding environmental justice broadly across the general plan. We ultimately decided for the latter approach, which is to incorporate it broadly, because we wanted to make sure that environmental justice wasn't going to be siloed. We really wanted to make sure that the housing element and the transportation element and all the other parts of the general plan were addressing environmental justice. But at the same time, we wanted to create this framework document as almost like an index or like a higher level policy goal. So I hope that answers that question. Please feel free to add additional questions. I think also, since it seems like we're doing pretty well in time, we can also like open it up and have people unmute and have more of a dialogue that way too. So here's another question. How are we advocating for environmental justice versus some communities' hesitancies to change their behaviors, such as car use? So I'm not sure I totally understand the question. I'm wondering if whoever created that question might be able to either unmute and say the question more fully, or you can type it into the chat if you don't want to unmute.
So when I'm thinking about the like what is the environmental justice? Well, what is the justice in general? Like last week, Sophia and Malton were publishing various pieces saying that justice to them means people from our neighborhood should be free to drive everywhere, um, but and it seems like that should be fair because people from richer socioeconomic groups manage to drive everywhere. But to me, that feels sort of hollow because we're putting greenhouse gases, global warming, we're hurting people everywhere by doing that.
Thanks, Theodore. And if you wouldn't mind just muting again. Yeah, thank you. I think like your question kind of gets to more broadly the question of trade-offs. If I'm understanding it correctly, it is always a challenge with our general plan, to kind of balance some of these trade-offs. So like one kind of classic example that we think about is, the need to build more housing and more affordable housing, particularly, and then the fact that, a lot of our infill sites are, maybe have air pollution or they're close to freeways and things like that. And so, the general plan doesn't necessarily give like absolutes like that. It often does kind of, talk about different goals that we have as a city. And then it's kind of up to us as we go forward and as we implement the general plan to think about these trade-offs as we implement specific projects or policies, if that makes sense. Yeah, I think another way to think about it is like we're not doing an area plan, so we might not get down to like that level of specificity. It is kind of thinking more citywide.
I see Nina raised her hand.
Yeah, since we're having like general questions, I was also like just looking at this and thinking about this in a really comprehensive way when it comes to communities and neighborhoods. And I think housing and creating more spaces for a community is valuable, but I've also noticed that in some communities, those developments have, created kind of like a shadow or just like this building that just goes straight up in the air is honestly, in my opinion, an outdated model. So I was wondering if we're going to be exploring, ways that we can incorporate culture in kind of different kinds of shapes as a way for health and environmental health as well. More buildings that are less kind of just protruding into the air, but maybe multiple levels and have green roofs on it that people could hang out on and eat at a cultural organic restaurant or something. So I think I just kind of went off right now, but I was just wondering if we will be kind of visioning on that kind of scale as well in terms of really reimagining the way we approach planning in general from a more environmental and regenerative perspective.
Great. Thank you, Nina. And then just going forward, if people want to say like their name and then organization, just so we know where people are coming from too. That's a really great question. And I love that you bring up culture specifically. Something as we've started talking more with like other agencies and and partners about this work, is there isn't much in the general plan that specifically talks about culture and about neighborhood empowerment, which is why we're really glad that SB 1000 actually does really talk about, how do you engage community? Because we don't have like a community engagement element, for example, it's kind of maybe embedded throughout the general plan, but not really addressed directly. So we would love to be able to highlight positive examples and aspirations for how we can, really work with community organizations, artists, other kind of like idea and thought leaders to incorporate things like culture and social cohesion, right? Because I think that's like a big part of culture, right? As part of, the planning process, certainly, but then just about how the city works in general. And that's actually a point I also want to underscore, even though, Danielle and I are both from the planning department, this really is meant to be the city's general plan. It's not just the planning department's plan. So, even though like we will include policies that are, related to planning, we also want to think more broadly than that.
That's great that you're creating this kind of interdepartmental, community-wide collaborative approach. And I also think that cultures have so much to offer in terms of like a lot of traditional indigenous cultures lived in harmony with nature. So I think that it would be great to bring that into our modern societies as pathways for innovative, positive ways of being that are more in sync with the planet.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I think, this year has kind of taught us that we all need to rethink how we're doing our work. And so I think we're looking forward to this working group and to this work more broadly. And then another thing just to also highlight is, environmental justice work has been happening across the city, but it's often been in specific neighborhoods or specific agencies. And so that's kind of another key opportunity with this work is to think more broadly and collaboratively. Yeah, I think it is a great opportunity.
Thank you.
So we have another question from Gabriella. So how much is the grant allocated for organizations? That's an excellent question. So we haven't set the specific amount, but basically, as we get organizations who express interest in them, we're going to be working with them to develop a scope of work. So, we want to make sure that whatever funding we provide is fair and is comparable to, how the city partners with organizations in terms of, like the hours and the rates and all of that. But it's all very TBD because as I said, we really want to learn from you. And especially right now, we know that so many of our prior models of doing outreach are being completely rewritten during the pandemic. And so we definitely want to work with organizations who are doing this work to hear, what will work and what is feasible during this context. So sorry, I can't give like the specific amount, but hopefully that gives you like a little more idea. It's basically somewhat negotiable. Okay, other questions? So I see a question from Russell. Is there a framework for how ideas rise or fall during the process, or is that TBD? So that is a really good question. And Danielle, please feel free to chime in because we have been doing a little bit of almost like peer city research. So for example, we talked to Seattle because we really wanted to learn from what they were doing. We've talked with, people in other communities as well. There's not a ton of models for what we're trying to do with the working group. And so I think what we're really hoping is that it will be a collaborative space. And in order to do that, I think we're going to have to be really intentional about building trust and kind of creating those processes where we can bring ideas from our different perspectives and discuss them honestly and openly and have some way of making decisions as a group. So it is a little bit TBD because we don't know who's on the group. We don't know, for example, if there are organizations who would like to, help us like with facilitate meetings, for example, like that is an option under the community engagement grants. I think we're still sussing that out, but we are hoping that, this group will be able to develop a process to make decisions collaboratively and with consensus. Danielle, is there anything you want to add just from like any of our research or other best practices?
Thanks, Lisa. I think you answered it well. In addition to Seattle, we have also talked with partners at Contra Costa County, the CDC, and others within San Francisco. And I think a main trend, or the way I understand it, is how governance facilitates cooperation, or just like governance of the working group, not like governance SF planning. You know what I mean? And so I think being reminded of our value to lead with community voices and to co-create this with community leaders will be extremely important during those conversations. And also knowing that this is trying to create draft policies for the city. And so as much as that can encapsulate like a lot of environmental progress as possible is a good reminder for me.
We have a question here. I think it's from Chester. How can the working group not duplicate work already done by the city and others? That is a really good question. And it's hard to know because like we're saying, we don't want to predetermine what the group is going to work on or what it's going to decide are the priorities or the scope. So I would say, there is possibility that it will overlap with previous work, right? So if, for example, if we take an interest in, there's a whole section on climate resilience and justice, right? So if we have people who are really interested in that, we might identify priorities or goals or ideas for that area. At the same time, SF Environment is also working on their climate action plan, right? So that's a whole separate effort. And so that really speaks to why it's critical that we partner with the rest of the city. And that's what we've been working to do on the back end, is to identify people across all of these topics working at various city agencies to make sure that the work is connected to an additive of the work that they're doing. So a good example of how the work of this working group could supplement or add to the work of the climate action plan is maybe there are certain policies or goals that we really feel are specific to the environmental justice communities that are on that map. That might not be surfaced as part of the climate action plan because that's a citywide process. So I think that's kind of the example of the value of really working with these communities directly. Okay, so I think the questions are starting to slow down a little bit. So please feel free, if you have other questions, to type them in. We're also, willing to stay on the line. So even if, if we don't have any more questions, Danielle and I can just stay on and people can unmute and we can just talk more openly.
I see Sarah, you raised their hand.
Oh, somebody raised their hand. Sarah?
Yeah, Sarah.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for putting this together. I appreciate your time and all of the energy you're putting into this working group. I just wanted to be clear. I and my organization were involved in the housing policy group that preceded the SF planning virtual hearings, as well as this environmental justice working group. Just wondering to what degree you're considering previous organizations' involvement in the planning process when taking in these applications. I mean, should we feel like inclined to continue applying for these opportunities, or do you feel like the housing policy group was sufficient? Maybe not just for my organization, but other organizations that might be considering applying the same. Those organizations might be considering applying for this, and just wondering if there's any kind of weighted consideration of previous organizations' involvement.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think we fill a lot of criteria that you're looking for in this, but I just want to be clear, we've been involved in the process. I mean, so our orgs that have been involved in the process still encouraged to apply for this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there, it's not just the process. There are a lot of processes that happen across the city. So yeah, that's great that you've been involved in the housing policy group as part of the housing element. So we definitely encourage people to note on their applications what other efforts they've been involved in. There's actually a question that relates to that specifically, where you can note like what like city as well as other processes you have been a part of. So it's definitely helpful context for us to see what other sorts of experience groups are bringing to the table. But yeah, I don't know that we're like necessarily like saying like, oh, if you haven't been part of a city process, you can't apply. We really do want to have a diversity of experiences on the group.
Thank you.
Question. Any other questions? And you can also feel free to just raise your hand. Okay. There were some other questions we had prepared that people didn't ask. Would it be helpful if we went over any of those? You can just like give a quick yes, no in the chat. Okay. So you see on the slide, we already answered number 1. Number 2, I think we may have partially answered. So again, the kind of the key product from the working group is going to be the EJ framework, which is going to be like a high level policy vision for the city. I do encourage you to look at the Seattle example for kind of like a flavor of what this could look like. So it might not get down to like all of like the implementation details, but the idea is that it's like setting a direction for the city to move towards. We encourage people to really try to attend all of the meetings if they can, because we think it's really important for building trust in the group and accountability, and for really just getting the work done. We know that people are extremely busy right now, especially many of the organizations and the neighborhoods on this map. People are really stretched thin. And so it's kind of a related question, number 4. We have had people ask us, can I apply as an individual only, or can we apply as an organization? We're kind of taking that as like a case by case sort of thing. So you can note on the application if you feel like, I really want to be involved. I'm not sure if I can make it to all 6 meetings. Could I have like an alternate person from my organization come for some of those meetings? And we'll try to work with people, because we know that this is such an extremely challenging time. I think if that does happen, the onus would be on those members of the working group to ensure continuity. So for example, if we have somebody apply and they absolutely can't make 2 of the meetings, let's say, it would be up to them to ensure that the person from their organization who's subbing for those 2 meetings is totally like up to speed and has all the information that they need to fully participate. Okay, if we don't have any other questions, Danielle and I can hang on the line for until 2, or however long people want to hang out. I know it's so hard to have interaction via Zoom, so we kind of wanted to just make it a little informal at the end. If you want to just stay and chat for a little bit, we're happy to do that. But again, we're really grateful for you being here and being interested in this work. We hope to hear from you, and we are really looking forward to partnering, hopefully, with some of you on moving this forward. Danielle, is there anything else you wanted to say as we close out the official portion?
I just really appreciate everybody being here, and you're very all Zoom proficient, and appreciate you raising your hand, unmuting, thumbs up, and hope to connect with you all again soon. Thank you for the work that you do.
Hi, Cassie. Is your hand still raised?
I don't know why it's raised, sorry.
Oh, it's okay.
I'll lower it for you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Lisa and Danielle. This is Karen. I got on late.
Hi, Karen.
And number 1, your answers were great.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, wait, I think there may be another question too. I was just searching in the chat. If Maribel is still on the line, they asked, how big do you imagine this group will be?
Oh, yes, I see Maribel's still on the line.
Pardon, Maribel, lost in all my chats too.
Maribel, we specified 7 to 15 community members on the application. And then we haven't determined how many city members. I think we're trying to be a little bit flexible, because we don't really know what people's capacity is right now. And so that's why it's kind of a big range of community members. We want it to be big enough where we really can have a diversity of neighborhoods and experiences, but we don't want it to be so big that it's really unmanageable and it's hard to kind of have that cohesive group. So we're kind of trying to thread that needle a little bit.
So I want to finish my thought. I thought your answers were great. I'm not sure if some of the folks really get the key that the community voice should be the communities that are in fact environmental justice communities, and the folks who actually experience the kinds of issues that a planning department plan develops along the way, okay? So I think some of the people who are on this call are folks that are well-versed in working with the city on large plans, all right? And that's great. And there are opportunities in some of those other elements. So don't think that your voice won't be heard. But what we really need, and I want to really encourage, is that people who don't think that their voice is heard, generally speaking, apply. I don't want them to be intimidated by the process. This is an environmental justice process, and that's exactly the number one criterion that we need to be looking for. You know, are these the voices that are not heard? So I want to be really clear about that, because I've been on a few of these meetings now, and I've heard mostly from folks who really don't represent the environmental justice community that's within their neighborhood.
Mhm. Thank you, Karen. Yeah, I think that's definitely valid. And yeah, I mean, I think hopefully it's clear when people are applying, when they see the criteria, that we really are targeting these neighborhoods, and specifically that, you know, we want organizations that can speak to environmental justice issues. So things like public health, you know, pollution, food access to transportation, public facilities, et cetera.
Yeah, and I think your answers actually were really good and did cover that, but I'm not sure that everybody is really clear on why it is so important that rather than have a separate element that is environmental justice, we are working to have it incorporated in all of the other elements, because this is the opportunity for those other voices.
Thank you so much. You know, what she just said is so true. My organizations and stuff, we've been trying to work with the Department of Environment and Planning for years. And it's just always like taking somebody else's, ideas, or taking them from some other country or wherever. And so we're just happy to see that this is finally, you know, we hate that it took COVID to do this, but I'm so glad that you're finally getting somewhere, and we're looking forward to this.
Thank you, Carla. Yeah, I think we're all really eager to, you know, kind of open up the conversation. To your point, Karen and Carla, it's you know,
and you got to remember that the funding's got to be a part of this conversation in a deeper way, because a lot of times they are always asking for our organizations to come through, but then it's an arduous process and no one wants to pay. And then, and you know, and in my community, like I live in Yerba Buena, it is devastated by COVID. Like, I mean, extremely devastated. And the hate crimes that have been going on against, you know, the businesses and the people in my community is, you know, and all of it kind of stems from the divestment into the community and what the community needs, and kind of into like what the bike lobby wants, what YIMBY wants, and not really what we need. And so we're hoping that the voices from the SumCons, you know, my organization, Smart Cohort, and others can be, you know, can be uplifted so that we can get help to people right now through this, and then be able to, you know, build back better.
Thank you, Carla. I encourage others who are on the call, you know, if you feel so inclined to, you know, say hello. Yeah, it's, you know, we're launching this work at a very strange time, so it's been hard to, you know, kind of make new connections. So I'm glad to see that we have different neighborhoods, different types of organizations at the event.
I have a question. I know that here, Augustine with Baby Advocates, I just had a question in regards to like all the planning and everything. Is there going to be a portion of this or a section of this in regards to like the mental health um, aspect? Just because in regards to like everything that is happening within the pandemic, I'm curious to know that within the EJ planning as well within community, there we have to consider all these factors of like mental health, the well-being of individuals who are living in these communities and aren't sure of what to do with their with how to talk about those or actually have a conversation with their families in regards to like mental health and that. So that was I was just curious to know if there was like going to be a section of that that's going to be looking that you guys are thinking of putting in implementation of also educating folks in regards to like that everything that's happening with the EJ work, but also in regards to like their mental health and their well-being of folks.
Thank you, Augustine. Is that how you say your name?
Yeah, Augustine, or you can say Augie for short.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for being here and raising that excellent point. I think people think, the planning department in particular, and they think like physical environment, right? Like housing and where infrastructure goes. But, just as critical is our social environment and, how that impacts people and our emotional health and our mental health. And so, I think it'd be great if we can fold that in somehow. I don't know if it's a part of, the work that's really focused on like social cohesion and neighborhood empowerment, or maybe there's ways to weave it throughout. But, I think it's definitely a critical issue, especially right now with all the trauma that communities are going through.
Thank you so much for talking about the trauma, because our community has been devastated by COVID, and there's been an oversimplification of how to make that work, where slow streets have actually made it very dangerous for people in our community, where they can't get around and they have to go to the next bus stop. They don't know where the bus stops are. The disabled people don't, they haven't been able to access. We have not had free transit like in a lot of other communities, like Los Angeles and Miami and other places. So and lots of people are cut off from the internet, and we seem to overly have benefits and things that are only accessible if you have a mobile phone, if you're banked, and the idea that you have internet connection. So we really these are some of the things that like we really need to focus on. Like even this is online, and we need to find a way for us to like reach people, and we really want to help with that.
Mm-hmm.
And we see so many of our like in my community, like SumCon in the Filipino Cultural Center. I want to uplift them, because a lot of times no one goes to them, and they don't really have a lot of a lot of folks talking with them. And so make sure that they are on this list, and that somebody specially reaches out to them over there. The reason why is the planning department gave them the worst part of town for the Filipino Cultural Center, and they have a lot of seniors and things. And now during this time of COVID, they literally have the seniors like in this neighborhood having to fend for themselves and things. And there's a lot of crime, and they don't report it.
Mm-hmm.
They just deal with it because they're happy to have the cultural center. But things like that need to be revisited as we build back better. Maybe they should be moved to a better location, so that they can be safer. I mean, these are the EJ, concerns are like, it's environmental, but it's also social justice and economic justice, and it needs to tie better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely, Carla. And Danielle showed the list of topics that we had kind of planned to cover in the EJ framework, but that's a starting point, right? Like I think part of this work is really listening to people in these communities to hear like what are the needs before we talk about, what are the goals and the priorities going forward, right? So thank you for sharing some of the challenges that you're seeing both in the neighborhoods where you live and work. We definitely want to hear more stories like yours. So I think we're just about at time, but thank you all so much for hanging to the end. And please feel free to get in touch with both of us if you have other questions or comments or feedback. And we look forward to hopefully seeing your applications.